Hello, and welcome to Meaning Matters, how higher education can help students find purpose in life and career. Hosted by LearningWell magazine, the Coalition for Transformational Education, and Gallup. I'm Marjorie Malpede, the editor of LearningWell, and I want to thank you all for joining us today. Students are often encouraged to find their purpose, but do they really know what that means or how to go about it? And what is the role of colleges and universities in helping them in this journey? Who does this involve on campus? These are some of the questions that we will explore in today's discussion. We are excited to get started, and I will do so in just a sec. But I wanted to remind folks and encourage them, please put your questions in the Q&A box, and we will pause around 40 minutes in and take a number of questions from the audience. So at this point, I am delighted to now introduce our panelists. We are really excited to have this group of people here today. I'm going to start with Bill. William Damon is the director of the Stanford Center on Adolescence. He's a professor of education at Stanford University and a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. A developmental psychologist, Bill's research explores how people develop purpose and integrity in their work, family, and civic life. He is the author of several books, including The Power of Ideals and The Path to Purpose, How Young People Find Their Calling in Life. Welcome, Bill.
Hello, Marjorie. It's great to be here
Hello.
with you.
It's great that you can join us today. I'm really excited that you were able to make it. So our next panelist is Stephanie Markin. Stephanie is a senior partner at Gallup, leading its U.S. Custom Research Division, which includes research programs Gallup performs on behalf of foundations, agencies, corporations, and higher education institutions. She is responsible for the strategic direction of Gallup's research and education, workforce development, climate, technology, and the social sciences. Hello, Stephanie.
Thanks so much for having me.
Welcome. Excited to get started. And then our last panelist is Wendy Fishman. Wendy is a research project director at Project Zero at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Since 1996, her research has focused on the meaning of work and education in the lives of young children, adolescents, and novice professionals. She is lead author of Making Good, How Young People Cope with Moral Dilemmas at Work, and she is co-author with Howard Gardner of The Real World of College, What Higher Education Is and What It Can Be. Hello, Wendy.
Hi, thank you for having me.
It's great to have you all here. And I am going to get us started right away. And I'm going to ask this question of Bill, and I think it'll be obvious to the audience when I do ask it. So, Bill, your research has led to the widely acknowledged definition of purpose, what it is and what it is not. Can you describe that for us, and also why that is so important to realizing the benefits of purpose?
Yes, and thanks for that important question. Purpose is a goal, but it's not just any kind of goal. I had a goal this morning to find a parking place in town, which was actually not easy. But I don't think anybody would call that my purpose in life. It doesn't qualify as a purpose in life. Here's what makes purpose special and why it has a special role in both our individual lives and for what people can do for society. First of all, purpose is an active commitment. It's something that you kind of stick with and do something about. It's not just a dream. We might all want to have world peace. That might be something that is something I think that most people would love to have. But if you're only thinking about how nice it would be, rather than doing something about it, it's not a purpose. It's a dream. It's something that a wish. It's a commitment. It's something you stick with. It's not a one-time deal. You can do wonderful things on a one-shot basis. You can be walking past a river and see a drowning child, and at the risk of your life, jump in to save the child. That's a great thing to do. But again, that's not your purpose in life, unless you happen to be always sitting by the river watching out for kids. But most people aren't doing that. So it's an active commitment. It's something you stick with, and it's something that's meaningful to you. If somebody orders you to do something, even if it's a valuable thing to do, you're not doing it purposefully if you don't believe in it. If a child does homework, which I think is a good thing for kids to do, but only if the child is only doing it to please the parent or the teacher, or because the child is ordered to do it, the child isn't being purposeful about it. Unless the child at some point says, well, this is helping me learn, this is a good thing, I own it, I'm on board with it. Then it becomes purposeful, not just, well, I have to do it or else I'll get in trouble. So it has to be meaningful. And then finally, the final criteria is that purpose goes beyond the self in some way. It transcends the self. It's an attempt to accomplish something that makes a difference in the world beyond the self. And when you put all of these criteria together, you have what is special about purpose. And it's an active commitment to accomplish something that's meaningful to the self and goes beyond, in some way, makes a contribution to the world beyond the self. And it's exactly those definitional criteria that explain why purpose is important, because people who are purposeful get a lot done because they are actively committed, they stick with it, it's long-term, they don't quit, they're energized, they're motivated. And for the individual, purpose has a lot of benefits that, again, derive from the special features of purpose, such as when you try to go beyond the self and contribute to the world, you're not self-centered. You're not always thinking about me. It's not all about me. And there are lots of motivational and mental health benefits that come from not being overly self-centered, as we know. So it's exactly what makes purpose special as a concept that also contributes to purpose's value, the value of purpose to society and the self.
Mm. So purpose is not something that can be imposed on you. Therefore, you wouldn't actually realize the benefits of it, as you say. So that's an important definition and point to make when we start talking about how it is that you can help students with their purpose making. Because I think understanding what it is and what it's not is going to be really important to people who are doing this work on campus.
That's right. You can't tell a child you need to have purpose, or tell a child, here's what your purpose is going to be. You can create conditions and provide resources for the child or the student, if we're talking about higher education, that facilitate and help the students search for purpose and commitment. There are lots of things you can do that will be helpful, but you certainly cannot write the script of life for anybody, including your own child. The child does have to bring himself or herself to it actively.
Right. That's great. So Stephanie, I'm going to move to you now. Gallup has done so much work in this area, and you personally have. What does your data show about the correlation between purpose and well-being, particularly in young people?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, there is a really important relationship, probably not surprising when you reflect upon Bill's helpful definition and grounding in terms of what purpose is and what it can provide you, that it has a relationship with well-being, but it really does have an important relationship. And we know this empirically through our research and partnership with Bates College, where we looked at the relationship between having purpose in work and your life overall, as well as your self-reported well-being and life evaluation. What we find in that research is for those who essentially don't have a sense of purpose in their work, just 6% of them are thriving in their overall well-being. Now, when you look at those who do have a sense of purpose in their work, 60+% of those people are thriving in their well-being. So it's essentially a 10 times fold relationship between your sense of purpose in life and your overall well-being. Now, of course, at the same time, we're also in a little bit of a well-being crisis in the US and globally. And this has been coming long before the pandemic, although we love to blame it on the pandemic like everything. But we found at Gallup, when we were measuring issues of sadness, anxiety, stress, worry, depression, over the course of the last 2 decades in the US and globally, essentially there's a rising tide of unhappiness that was happening around the world leading up to the pandemic. Now, the pandemic really exacerbated it, and I think especially for our college campuses who were struck with all of this unprecedented change at the same time they were trying to address the well-being crisis students were facing. But that rising tide of unhappiness has really been setting in for some time, long before the pandemic occurred. What I think it's left us with is this question about what do we do to address student well-being? What we know is the consequence of not having purpose is also lower well-being. So in that way, purpose can be an incredible lever and tool to actually improving well-being and mitigating some of what we see as a mental health crisis in the United States. It's very hard on a day-to-day basis to feel like you're thriving overall if you feel like what you're doing on a day-to-day basis is lacking that purpose that Bill just described. So I would say the consequence of not having purpose in your day-to-day life is rather significant from a well-being perspective. And we see this true in the workplace experiences. So for those of you who are less familiar, Gallup's been measuring employee engagement for the better part of the last 30 or so years. And in that research, we ask a series of questions called the Gallup Q12 that are used to assess overall employee engagement. One of the questions actually asks about whether or not the mission or purpose of your organization makes you feel your job is important. If you're seeing that connection between your day-to-day and the overall purpose of the organization. What's interesting is in the last few years, we found employee engagement has really stagnated in the US. In fact, it's declined a little bit over the last few years, and now it's essentially stabilized in the last 12 months. But the greatest decline has actually come because people are really missing the connection between what they're doing on a day-to-day basis at work and the mission and purpose of their overall organization. When you're lacking that connection, it's very hard to feel purposeful in your work, very hard to feel engaged from an employee perspective. And of course, we know there are a series of important outcomes when we have high levels of employee engagement. People are more productive, as Bill said. They're more likely to stay at their organization. They're less likely to have high healthcare costs associated with them. So important organizational outcomes, but mission or purpose continues to also pop up in this important issue of employee engagement. So the consequence of not having purpose at work is low levels of employee engagement, which we find is hugely influential to an organization's success when they think about their collection of employees. So there's so many important contexts in which we have to talk about purpose at work, in school, but the consequence of low purpose is low well-being overall, as well as low employee engagement.
And Stephanie mentioned, maybe it was on this call, on the webinar, or prior to this, the Bates study that talked about students seeking purpose, believing they need it in their life and in their work, but feeling as though they did not have a sense of purpose and didn't feel that their college experience really led to that. I might ask you to just comment on that, and then it's a bit of a pivot to Wendy's work too. But do you have a comment on that before we move to Wendy?
Yeah, so in our research with Bates College, we found that a majority of US adults reported that they felt like having purpose in their work was very or extremely important to them, at about 80% of all of those who we surveyed. And yet just less than half of them reported they had purpose in their work. So an important gap in self-reported importance to them and the extent to which they were actually realizing that purpose.
Okay, great. The reason I bring that up is, Wendy, I really want to ask you about some of the reasons driving that. And I think these are going to be important considerations when we start talking about what higher education can do. So your research at Harvard is amazing. It includes interviews with thousands of young people for the work that you've been doing. So my question is, what do you see in understanding the attitudes and mindsets of these young people? What cultural and societal dynamics do you think really sort of affect their ability to find purpose?
Well, thanks for that very big question. And it's fun to go last.
It's big.
Stephanie and Bill both touched on a part of what I was going to say. But first, I think it's important to mention that the way in which we go about doing research, which is very different than what Stephanie described. So this is a panel put together very well. We do qualitative, in-depth research based on interviews and conversations, usually about an hour for each individual, in which we listen very carefully to what they say and what they don't say. So we don't ask pointed questions, but we ask very broad-based questions. And this research, based on how young people view education and work in their lives, began in the 1990s. Bill remembers probably it very well from collaboration with Howard and Mahai, where we started interviewing 10-year-olds about their work. We found very few of them, even though they felt a serious calling to do what they were doing at a very young age, talked about purpose, both in terms, but even in Bill's sense of the word. Most of them talked about their work being for I, not for others. Some of the young community service providers talked about that, but very few of the other young people ever talked about their work being connected to other people. And not only that, but they also, when faced with difficult situations, said ethics are for later. So even in the way in which they worked, not even how they described their work, but the way in which they worked didn't exemplify Bill's definition of purpose. And then we found similarly when we launched our study of higher education, as Marjorie, you just mentioned, in 2012, which involved 1,000 college students across the country, first-year students and graduating students, we found this preoccupation again with I in the way they described their goals of what they wanted to get out of college, but also when we did word analysis, they used the word I 11 times as frequently as they did the word we. And even though we didn't ask about specific goals, most college students talked about grades, high GPAs, internships, first jobs. Very few of them talked about what we would call a larger purpose. Even though we did look for evidence or hints of this, very few talked about that. So all of this leads to, I agree with Stephanie about the importance of mission for an institution. And in our case, we're talking about higher education mission, because without a clear sense of what a school stands for and how it might want its students to develop over the course of college, which I personally believe should include that we see ourselves as contributors to society, not just getting jobs for ourselves. We need to have well-articulated from day number one or even day zero when people are looking at schools, well-articulated missions of what that means so that guides students and the rest of the community. Because without that, students tell us that there's lots of intrinsic messages floating around schools. Harvard students, for example, who may come to college thinking they want to become an artist or a teacher, are funneled into professions like law and finance. Other students at many other schools feel that they need to get jobs quickly rather than actually seeking what they think is important or might interest them. So we are currently working to study what we call these mission-driven institutions, historically Black colleges, religious schools, military academies, for example, or even schools focused on public service, to understand how they might serve as examples for the rest of the sector, to stand as schools that do have a specific mission. And hopefully we will find that they actually do change and transform students over the course of college and move that student needle from I to we.
That's great work. So I want to frame sort of a conversation among you all around how higher education can help with this, as we're hearing, complicated issue about helping students find their purpose. And I'm guessing that there are both practical solutions to this and then sort of the larger cultural ones, which Wendy, you alluded to, that we've been reading a lot about: vocationalism, careerism. But before we delve into that, and I just ask anyone to jump in, did any of you want to comment on what your peer panelists have just said? Because I know you may have a thought or two that before we jump into the next discussion, you might want to share.
I do have a couple of comments, and they actually, I think, will lead right into the bigger questions that you just asked, Marjorie, about what higher education can be doing more of. And my comment would be that exactly the kinds of trends that Stephanie was referring to which we've seen too in our research, where there has been a kind of a rising tide of unhappiness, which I think is directly connected with young people not finding something that's meaningful and something they can believe in beyond the self. And I think that higher education, for a lot of students, and when I say that, I don't mean everybody, I'm not trying to overgeneralize, but for a lot of students, higher education has not provided a context that gives them something to believe in. And there are a number of reasons for that. I'll just say them very quickly. And the background of this is that in our developmental research about how young people find purpose, there are three things that are really important that seem to be kind of universal. One is that there's some role model, somebody that is instantiating what purpose looks like in a flesh and blood way. Another is that the student finds some reason to be studying the material that the student is being given in a broader sense, not just I need to learn the formulas to pass the exam and get the degree, but here's what chemistry it does for the world and why it's important. And some active, some experience where the student is actively doing something, not beyond just reflecting and reading books and so on, but actually going out, having a lab experience or a field experience or a service learning experience or something like that. We know from our research that these are conducive to the development of purpose among young people. And I think in today's climate in higher education, so much has become so specialized in teaching everything from the humanities to the sciences, teaching undergraduates as if they're graduate students almost, rather than here's what Shakespeare means to your life, rather than a graduate level discussion. And there's been related to that, there's been a hypercritical atmosphere. Part of it, of course, is part of our society at this time when people are kind of at each other's throats and ideologically and so critical. And part of it is just some of the concepts that have inspired young people over the generations, like even the work ethic has come under criticism, even the work ethic and the idea of merit. So I think that colleges need to think about what messages they're providing for students. Are these inspiring messages? Need to provide students with opportunities to get actively involved in things that they could believe in, and this is the most provocative thing I'll say, need to become good role models for the students themselves. Actually show students what it's like to be purposeful. And this is on all of us. I'm a faculty member too, so I'm taking this on myself too. We need to be good role models and show students what it's like to believe in something and get out there and contribute to the world beyond the self.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think that's so right that purpose cultivation starts with people. There are a few of us who feel like we have purpose in our careers who don't feel like that was introduced to us somehow by somebody else, right? When I was conducting focus groups years ago in partnership with a university that was interested in purpose cultivation, I was interviewing a student, she was a senior, and she was telling me about this internship that she had while she was enrolled, and she didn't have it until the spring semester of her senior year, as so many currently enrolled students do. And she was in health sciences program, and she said, I had this internship, I was working in a hospital, I should have never been a health sciences major. I have no business working in the health field. And I thought, uh-oh. And she said, but I can't undo it now, right? I'm in the spring semester of my senior year. I can't undo this experience. I just have to keep moving forward. So great that she had the internship experience because, as Bill said, right, that's a key opportunity for her to explore and find that that wasn't her purpose. Sometimes it's purpose elimination rather than purpose identification that we're talking about. But it also happened in the spring semester of her senior year, right? And she was at a very expensive, highly elite institution, and she, foregone a lot of opportunity and financial costs to be there. She couldn't redo that educational experience. So I always think, what would happen to her if she'd had that internship the spring semester of her freshman year, her first year at that institution? Maybe she could have identified a more purposeful path, a path that she was more passionate about. So I think the experiential piece is so critical to this. We find in our research, only about 40% of currently enrolled bachelor's seeking students report they had an internship experience, and an even smaller percentage say it's one that allowed them to apply what they were learning in the classroom. So we're missing a significant proportion of the currently enrolled college student population when it comes to internships that are often that purpose identification elimination strategy. And then the other thing I'll say about that is very few first generation college students are having those experiences. That rate is even lower. It's about 27% of currently enrolled first gen students say that they had that internship experience. So I think that's a key part of this, is how do you get high quality experiential learning to a larger number of currently enrolled college students? And then second, how do you connect people to these students to help them unlock that purpose, that people part of this? Well, we're conducting really important research in partnership with Walton Family Foundation, interviewing Gen Z members. And we interview individuals that are 12 to 18 years old. In that process, we ask them about their experience while in school. In our most recent research in partnership with Walton, we found that just about 28% said that they had somebody in their lives, an adult in their life, that helped them and encouraged them to pursue their goals and dreams. That's a very small percentage of our currently enrolled middle and high school student population, which is a little troubling, right? That they're lacking an adult in their life who's really that encourager, who's often helping them think about what is their purpose, what would they be passionate about, how could they make a unique contribution to the world around them. So I think it's people and experiences, and I think we have a lot of work to do to get a larger number of currently enrolled students to access both of those tools.
Yeah. And if I could just add to both of you, similarly, we have found when we've asked the 1,000 college students, who might you turn to when you're not sure what kind of decision to make? There's an ethical decision, a difficult, not right or wrong answer. Very few college students had anyone on campus that they actually named. The most frequent answer was the mental health counselor. And the second most frequent answer was mom. So that will tell you a lot about what's lacking on the college campus. And part of, I think, and both of you spoke with this, part of what I would add, Bill, to your list of things that need to happen in higher education is making or helping and encouraging students to feel that they have agency to solve problems that do affect the larger community. Students told us that cheating and academic dishonesty was rampant, but they didn't feel like it was their problem or their responsibility to help solve. So I think engaging students in what we call ethical dilemmas about what's right and what's wrong, but also those things that affect other people, not just themselves, and helping them feel like they have the responsibility to work with others to solve those kinds of problems. So I agree. It's both their experiences on campus, but also lack of any of these role models for how to help solve these problems that they really express to us.
So I'm hearing two big themes here. One is experiences that engender this sense of purpose. And Bill, you talk about it. The purpose isn't something that you should feel bad about not having if you haven't found it by 21. Purpose is something that purpose seeking is something that you have throughout your life. But college is where you can go about the practice, art, and science of finding purpose. So Stephanie's great point about bringing these experiences that have you exploring purpose much earlier, so that you don't get into a situation where you're sort of pigeonholed into something that you may not be satisfied in life around. That's the experience piece. I'm really interested in the messaging piece that Wendy, you talk about, and it is connected to this movement of I to we. We know that moving from I to we is good for not just the world, but for yourself, right? Because that is proven to help with well-being, help with mental health. Yet the messaging and the reality for so many of these students is not really to move there. In fact, there was a recent New York Times op-ed that I thought was really interesting by a recent graduate from the University of Pennsylvania. It was called "Careerism is Killing College." And she talks about this thing called pre-professional pressure in college, where it's sort of the opposite of exploring your identity. It's really, this intense competition to get yourself into very, very linear and limiting career paths. So I shouldn't have said all that because I'm the moderator, not the panelist. So I'm going to stop and ask you guys to talk a little bit more about two things. What are we doing wrong, and how can we improve?
Yeah.
Can I just go first? I'll be quick and then let Stephanie and Bill respond. When I give a talk about our college study, there's two cartoons that I often show. One was from the New Yorker, and it's a parent dropping off a kindergartner and saying to the kindergartner as she walks off, remember, kindergarten is excellent opportunity to network for first grade. And the problem is, for a lot of these college students, they're walking in the door with these messages. And it's very hard to undo those messages in 4 years of college when students are transitioning to a higher level coursework, trying to navigate their ways on a college campus, figuring out what anthropology even means, and what do I want to do with the rest of my life. So I would just say these messages are powerful from birth. And in fact, I mentioned our work that started in the 1990s. We started interviewing 10-year-olds. We called that Project Origins, but we just incidentally began looking in our research center, Project Zero, at preschools, because at 10 years old, maybe the roots have taken, there's too many roots already. And we're interested in what preschool messages students are getting from home and also from school. So all this to say, I know that doesn't, Marjorie, help you with the higher education sphere, but I think this problem is major because students are coming in with such rooted messages of the transactional nature of education, and that they have to perform and they have to succeed and they have to get high grades in order to get jobs. And this is what is causing mental health problems on the college campus. So I think that that's a strong part of the messaging.
I'll just share my personal story on this, which is, I went to Elon University for my undergraduate degree, and I was an unenrolled major, and I was sitting down with my advisor to declare my major, and he'd just been randomly assigned to me. He was a history professor, and he said, what do you want to declare? And I said, business. And he said, why business? And I said, because I really need a job when I leave here. And I was a first generation college student. I had made a lot of personal financial sacrifice, as had my family, in order for me to be there. And I felt this immense pressure to get a job. And I thought, that is the connection, right? What I study, having a job that's waiting for me is necessary. And he said, what are you passionate about? And I said, I love the political science department. I love the polling center. I've had this internship. It's been amazing. He said, do that. It will work out. Trust me. And I changed majors and ultimately declared in the political science department. I found a career that I love through that polling center. And it was a really good example of just one faculty member taking an extra few minutes to really invest in understanding what drove me as an individual, and making sure that they encouraged me and did that message kind of reconstruction that Wendy described, to say, if you do what you love, there will be a connection, you will be successful. But I will say, I remember distinctly the pressure I felt as a first-gen college student who was financing that education myself, and who had asked my family members to extend themselves rather significantly in order to make that degree possible. So I have a lot of empathy for those students who think, well, I have to have a job when I leave here, and what is my surest path to do so? So I think we also have to make sure that we're making that connection for students, that when you're doing something that you are purposeful in, you will be more productive, you will be more successful. That is also a pathway to a great job. It's not just about the actual discipline or what you're studying. It's the extent to which you're deriving something from it that will ultimately yield something much bigger and better than you can imagine. So I think the pressure that students are feeling, especially given current costs, which I think factor into all of what we're describing, is rather significant. I just have a lot of empathy for those students.
Correct. Two things I'd like to jump into based on what Stephanie just said. I might direct this at Bill in terms of the body of work you have around this. So finding a good, solid career with family sustaining wages, that's a very important goal. It's not contrary to finding purpose, correct? We shouldn't be thinking that, or I really want to get that job at Goldman Sachs, but I should be looking for something that is more altruistic. There's this kind of misinformation around what careers you can have purpose in and what you can't. Can you talk a little bit about that and maybe clear that up for us?
Sure. And again, thanks, Marjorie. That's a really important point that I think is not always appreciated, that self and other goals are not trade-offs in the realm of purpose. In fact, we have research with the adult part of the population that shows that people who are highest on purpose are also very energetic and very high on self goals, such as entertainment or travel and so on. So it's not as if the purposeful people are somehow martyrs or even extreme altruists, that they sacrifice everything about their own personal lives. It's quite the opposite. And I think Stephanie gave a little sense of this by saying that a purposeful career is a win-win. This is also what we found in the Good Work Project too, that people who are really invested and dedicated in using their career for the public good are also very highly successful very often in terms of all the self goals of including financial goals and every other kind of self-oriented kind of consideration. So I would say realistically, what can and should colleges do? Colleges can help students increase their capacity to be purposeful about whatever it is they choose to do in life. And by the way, purpose is not only attached to work, it's all in vocation. People have purpose in their family life. Raising children is a purposeful activity. Civic purpose applies to being attached to society and wanting to contribute to the community. So there's lots of realms of purpose. And the question is, are you purposeful about what you are choosing to do? That is the question, because there are lots of realms of life, vocation, family, faith, civics, art, music. I mean, lots of realms. Are you being purposeful about it, or are you just going through the motions, or doing it for some reason that is cynical or not fully invested in it? And just as a final word on this, and this repeats what I said earlier, I'm afraid that too much of the discourse in colleges today is cynical. And I think that's maybe a problem that goes beyond colleges and the culture at large. And Wendy alluded to that, but it's also something that colleges have to own. What kind of messages are you giving young people? And there are cynical career messages that, well, you know, what you really just want to do is go out and all you want to do is think of the financial bottom line. There are civic cynical messages, which lead to tribalism and all the kinds of civic problems we have. And lots of other kinds of highly overcritical ways of undercutting the kinds of belief systems that for ages, for maybe eternity, have inspired young people and help young people have that wonderful idealism that the colleges should be contributing to and not undermining.
Great point. Great point, Bill. Wendy, you're shaking your head. Any comments on that?
I'm in agreement, but I'm also thinking about half of our country that's also cynical that college is even worth going to. So it's a difficult situation, I think, in all realms. I mean, half of our country thinks that it's all based on return on investment and are questioning whether college is even worth it or bad for us as humanity. And I think, you know, that's challenging. I think schools, colleges, we have found, and universities are trying to please so many different customers and trying to keep their customers happy that they're trying to do too many things. And I have this sense, I agree with you, Bill, that the conversation has become cynical, but students come and are confused about what college actually is, because there's just too many goals that are trying to be promised and promoted in order to keep students there and to attract students in the first place. And so it's no wonder why people are confused, and then it's easy to become cynical, because if you have too many goals, you can't accomplish anything, let alone learning, which is supposed to be the reason one goes to college.
And this is a challenge for college leadership. We need to have good spokespersons for colleges that talk about the highest ideals of college and what universities contribute to the well-being of individual students, to society, and truth and justice and all of the great ideals. And if colleges do that, and this takes a note from what Stephanie was saying earlier, these are win-win. That colleges will also find themselves being more successful, less criticized. There'll be less people doubting the value of colleges, and they'll actually do better business. But we need to have that leadership, and we've had that in the past, for sure. I've observed incredibly inspiring leaders in colleges in the past, and I'm just hoping that that a new cohort emerges in the future that can strike that high note, that can get people to believe in the value, the great value of higher education, which has been one of the treasures of our country for generations. And I'm not hearing enough true believers among the college leaders that really buy into that, rather the messages we've been talking about.
I'll share a statistic to maybe give us some optimism for the future, which comes from recent research we conducted in partnership with Lumina Foundation. Some of you on the call may have been tracking some of our work through the State of Higher Education study over the last 4 years. We've been interviewing about 12 to 14,000 currently enrolled and prospective students, those who have stopped out temporarily or never before enrolled. In totality, everyone who we surveyed does not have a degree or credential. And in that survey last year, we actually asked how valuable a series of different pathways were to having a successful career. And what we found was the majority of those who we surveyed, whether they were currently enrolled, stopped out, or never before enrolled, said that they thought a certificate, a certification, a 2-year, 4-year, or even graduate degree were extremely or very valuable to having a successful career, which I thought was really encouraging at a time where Gallup is also reporting a lack of confidence in higher education as an institution. And some people will sometimes ask me, how can those two things track at the same time, right? How can people have less confidence in the industry at the same time they're saying that these various pathways are extremely or very valuable? And I think it's a good reminder that you can have a strong output or a strong outcome from a system that you feel is flawed, that there's some sort of inaccessibility to it, which is often the criticism we hear, by the way, when we ask, why are you not confident? A lot of people talk about cost. A lot of people talk about the fact that they feel like the system isn't accessible to most Americans. So the good news, I think, is that they're still seeing value in the output. And yet we also know that that could be a leading indicator of continuing enrollment challenges, right? If people continue to feel less confident in the system, they might be less likely to access it. So I think the good news, glass half full, is that people still see value in these different pathways. I think the reality is we probably have some work to do to address some of those systemic barriers, whether they're perceived or actual, to make sure that this isn't a leading indicator of continuing enrollment challenges, which is what I worry about a little bit.
I'm going to bring in some audience questions now, even though I could sit on this webinar all day talking to you guys about this. One thing, though, before we open it up, is this idea, again, about the disparity between confidence in higher education and the acknowledgement of the value of higher education is vexing. And I do wonder if it has something to do with the experience that people are receiving in experiencing in college. And again, I'm going a little bit back to Stephanie, some of the work that you all done about certainly the Big Six experiences, and it really comes down to either mentorships, having someone who cared about you, and doing something in or out of the classroom that is meaningful. So I think there was more of a comment than a question. Sorry, but if anyone has a comment on that, feel free. If not, I think we'll start to take audience questions.
Yeah, while you look at that first audience question, I'll just say we did see having an internship that allowed you to apply what you were learning in the classroom essentially doubled the odds that you felt your degree was worth the cost. So I do think there's this very direct relationship that people see in applied learning experiences and self-reported value of their college experience. So to Bill's earlier point, scaling those experiences is in the interest of those institutions, because you will see commensurate improvements in things like self-reported value, belief your degree is worth the cost, likelihood to recommend the institution to others, are all linked to having those high quality experiences.
That's great. Thank you, Stephanie. This is kind of a related question. So this is for Bill. We'll start with Bill. Do you have any advice for working with students who are not intrinsically motivated to be in college, therefore have a difficult time engaging with the programs, regardless of how many opportunities we have built into the curriculum for trauma-informed, self-directed, and experiential learning?
My advice would be to first of all, do a lot of listening and find out what is of interest to the student, because every young person has something they're interested in, for sure. Every student, there's some spark of something, and I could list the possibilities are as broad as the human spectrum of experience. So first of all, get to know the student as an individual, and that speaks to the importance of college counseling and having built into the higher education system. Every student should have somebody in that college that knows what really makes that student shine, and then craft a curricular experience for that student that tracks those interests. And that could be, picking up a bit about what Stephanie was saying, I would load it heavily onto active experiences such as internships and labs and field-based experiences, where the student isn't only challenged to immediately understand reading materials and lectures and academic, but making connections between what's going on in the classroom and what the student is actually doing. But build it around the student's individual interests and talents. And that's where you start with students that are worried, that are not confident, that are having trouble connecting. Make that connection, help the student make that connection, because I guarantee you, every student has some talent, some interest that can be built upon by the college experience. Find out what that is. That's on the colleges, and that's where the counseling is very important.
Great. This next question is for Wendy. Did your study of college students in 2012 take into account the students' ages? Were non-traditional age students more likely to have purpose included in their answers?
That's a good question. So the study began in 2012, but we collected data until 2016 or 17. So it was actually 5 or 6 years of data collection. We did have some non-traditional age students in our study, but the majority was traditional age. So I can't even speak about any significant differences between those two groups. So I'm sorry about that, but if I don't want to make up anything, and it's not enough to be a significant comparison or difference.
Thank you, Wendy. This is similar in some ways. This next question, it's for any of you. It has to do with equity, which I'm also curious about. You know, this purpose work has to be something that can't just be for small elite liberal arts institutions to have. Everyone should have the opportunity to understand one's purpose. And I think that's an important point we think about. So this question is, I'm curious, this is the audience member, I'm curious about the extent to which this notion and perception of purpose varies when the data are disaggregated by race and ethnicity. It's important to look at the data through that lens when it comes to this conversation.
Let me just say quickly, because I want to dispel a myth or something that sometimes maybe highly intellectual people think, that purpose is somehow loaded towards people that are economically privileged or something like that. Our data and lots of other folks that have used our measures all around the world never find socioeconomic or gender associations with purpose. People in communities everywhere have purpose, or people in communities everywhere don't have purpose. In other words, the distribution of purpose across all of the different educational and socioeconomic groups do not vary. And that's not just our data, that's lots of data. And the reason is, if you think about my definition, there are so many ways that you can find purpose. And they're not, those of us in the professions, of course, immediately think about our own professional experiences and what has moved us. But folks working in any kind of service or craft at every level of society can believe in it, can see how it's serving other people, can take pride in doing a good job. And that's the same with families. People everywhere raise children. So folks everywhere have access to purpose at every level of education and privilege. And unfortunately, folks everywhere, including very, very privileged young people, sometimes have no purpose. That happens too. Pretty equal, so obviously equally across all the different groups.
Well, and if I could add, in our study, to exactly your point, across 1,000 students, 10 different schools, which differed in size, selectivity, public, private, commuter, residential, we found more similarities across students than we did differences. We did not collect data for ethnicity in a systematic way, but across majors, across where people grew up, whether they went to a private or independent school or a public school, across any kind of data that we did collect, we found many more similarities across all of our findings, which surprised us. I don't think anyone would have predicted that.
Well, the only thing I would add there is I think some of the opportunities on college campuses that allow people to further cultivate purpose, those are the opportunities for which we do see some sort of a differential experience based on student background. So I used the example of internships earlier, right? We find that first-gen students, our lower income students, Pell Grant student recipients are often less likely to have those high quality internships than their peers. Not to say they don't have purpose, because to Bill's point, it's not necessarily required that you have an internship in order to find your purpose. But I think that they have less opportunities sometimes to fully cultivate that purpose than other students like them. So I think that's the opportunity as I think about what could an institution do, right? What kinds of internships could be unlocked that are paid internships on campus that are currently unpaid opportunities? We know that for a lot of students, they can't afford to work for free. They can't forego a paid job or internship to take an unpaid higher quality job or internship. So how do we get more paid jobs and internships for those students so they can do that purpose cultivation experience? So that's the piece I think we have a little bit of work to do in terms of the equity lens on all of this, is how do we scale those opportunities to all students? Because to Bill's point, it's not that they don't have purpose, but they might not be able to live that purpose or explore it more fully or dive as deeply into it if they don't have those types of experiences made available to them.
Yeah, and our lab at Stanford just finished a 6-year longitudinal study of college students, and we found exactly what Stephanie said, which is that there are some experiences in college, and internships is one of them, that do promote at least some of the components of purpose among students. We've just published the paper off of that. And so we have evidence for exactly what Stephanie says. So it's certainly the case that students that are fortunate enough to experience certain kinds of conditions, and one of the others is the kind of interpersonal close advising that I mentioned before, but internships, field work, that kind of thing, those students do have an advantage, yes. So students that are fortunate to have college conditions that have those experiences that Stephanie mentioned, in our study, we have found do make some progress, more the students that have not experienced those.
This is a sort of a conceptual question for all of you. How important are intrinsically motivated educational methods as opposed to extrinsically motivated methods in enabling the development of purpose in young people? Anyone?
I'll take the question, but I don't want to do all the talking here, but I can try to answer it really quickly. The relation between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation in education is something that's fascinated people and had a lot of argument and controversy over the years. And of course, everyone really prefers the idea of intrinsic because that's what lasts and so on. But in fact, they're not, it's almost similar to what we said before. They're not really always in opposition. And sometimes the extrinsic, what makes the difference is you don't want the extrinsic motivation to crowd out the intrinsic motivation. So you don't want, well, the grades are so important that I'm not going to pay attention to the work. And that can happen. But in some of the great studies in developmental psychology, they've found what's called an inverted U-shaped curve, which is enough extrinsic motivation to get the student moving and to get the student to sit down and do the reading or do the math, but not so much that that's what the student perceives as being the main part of the experience, so that the intrinsic motivation can take over, because that's what you really want to happen, is the students to love learning. And so they're not really in opposition. It's just that you don't want, the phrase that's used in developmental psychology is the minimal sufficiency principle. You want the minimal amount of extrinsic motivation you could possibly get away with to get the students to actually sit down and do the work, but not so much that that's the message the student's taking away, because the intrinsic motivation is the gold standard. That's what you want to develop.
Well, and to that point, I think my fear is that students do focus too much on this transactional nature of feeling like they have to, we call it a mental model, have to get a job and an internship in order to make college worthwhile, because I think there is too much focus on the grades and on GPAs, and causing half of our students say that mental health problems are because of this notion of academic success. And academic success is not, to them, understanding difficult material or reading a book that they had never heard about before or learning about something new. It's about getting a 4.0. And that's literally what is stressing them out. So I do worry so much that the extrinsic is taking over.
So this will be the last question, and hopefully related, jumping off of what Wendy just said, or to our previous conversation on the sort of the bigger concept of what are we here for, right, in higher education, and what are we telling our students they're here for? This question is from the audience. Any suggestions or ideas on how to communicate the value of higher education when one-on-one with students, to students directly? Anyone want to take a stab at that? Stephanie, what would you say?
Well, I would say we would be remiss if we didn't mention some sort of career-related outcome. The reality is, right, the majority of currently enrolled college students in the US are not traditional 18 to 22-year-olds who are butts in seats like I was and are enrolled in person and taking courses in that format. So many of them are enrolling or re-enrolling later in life, and they're doing so with career-related outcomes in mind. So for the purposes of this conversation, at times we've been talking more about traditional 18 to 22-year-old students, but if we think about the actual student population in the US today, I would say that the most important thing to know is that for really all of them, when we interview them, we ask them, why are you enrolling in higher education in the first place? They mention jobs. Now, I don't think jobs and purpose, have to be counter to one another, or achieving a meaningful career has to be counter to your earlier point, Marjorie, or false dichotomy between that and having a good job. I think they're one and the same. So I think the message has to be to some extent about career, because if it's not about career, we're going to lose the entire reason that they enrolled in the first place. So I think centering on having a meaningful career would be really important, right? If I were providing advice to this industry, it would be, don't just talk about getting a job, talk about getting a good job. And what does a good job mean? It's a job that pays a fair wage. It's a job that gives you meaning. It's a job for which you'll derive purpose, right? So I think those components are absolutely associated with additional education and training beyond high school, and therefore can be that connection we make on the issue of value. But I think it's really important that we stay really clear to what is the prospective student worried about, and they are worried about that issue of career pathway, having a good job, having a career that they can actually advance within. So I think that has to be a part of the conversation about higher education. It doesn't have to be all of it, right? It can be a more nuanced conversation.
And
But
if
just
I
to
can
be
just
specific.
second, I agree totally with what Stephanie said. And if I can just second it with this addendum, which is, I think the way to do that, the most effective way to do that is to go beyond just the kind of abstract message that Stephanie gave, but to give cases. Who do you admire? If you're interested in becoming a doctor or a lawyer or a scientist or anything, what are some individual stories of some people who embody what you would like to become, and show them how exactly they were both masters of their career, and they had a great career because they could really do it really well, better than anybody else, or at least as well as anybody else, and also how they did it in a way that was driven by noble purposes, by the will to add something, to contribute something to the world, and how these things go together. They're not opposed. You don't sacrifice one for the other. And this is the route, the pathway to a great career. And give them some actual cases, examples. Talk about some people who are out there who are admirable, because I think that will move them in a way that a flesh and blood example moves people in a way that goes beyond just giving them the principles.
Got it. Wendy, real quick, because we've run out of time.
What would I say? Well, if I had the privilege of being able to speak to every college student, I would ask them, what is it that college can provide, that it can offer you here, that you can't get anywhere else? And I think going through that exercise would help people think and maybe even see it for what it is, a once-in-a-life opportunity to develop more fully your own capacity for learning and lifelong learning. And I think we don't ask students enough that question.
So huge thanks to William Damon, Stephanie Markin, and Wendy Fishman. This has been a fantastic conversation. Like I said, I could stay here all day talking to you, but really appreciate your time here today. I hope the audience did as well. If anyone has follow-up questions, please email me. My email is on the LearningWell website. I'd be happy to connect you with folks for additional conversations, information. Thank you so much.